A look now at the history of the former Soviet Union, from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to the Great Terror, World War II, and the Cold War aftermath. Former National Security Advisor and Harvard history professor Richard Pipes spoke with the National Review's William F. Buckley in 2001. This is just over 50 minutes.
At the request of management, as noted, I proceed as though this were a firing line program, imitating exactly the format of the 35-year-old program. Richard Pipes, familiar to those of you who have watched all 1954 of my book. It is startling from several points of view, notably its uncharacteristic brevity. It is called Communism, A History, and is 160 pages long, and appears under the sponsorship of the Modern Library, all of which is shorthand for saying to the reading public, you have just bought and are about to read a classic, which last week was listed on the Washington Post bestseller list. Professor Pipes is manifestly equipped to take on a classic in that field. He was born in Poland in 1923 and arrived in America 20 years later. He studied in Cornell but went soon to Harvard, so long ago as to make his link to it seem very nearly congenital. He took leave from his academic work to serve in the National Security Council as advisor to President Reagan on U.S.-Soviet relations. 10 years later, the Soviet Union folded up shop. It can be argued that Professor Pipes didn't himself push the Berlin Wall down, but it can't be denied that his labors contributed significantly to an understanding of what communism was about and what was needed to contend against it. What Mr. Pipes has here achieved is a sophisticated and readable primer on the most formidable ideological movement of the 20th century, which leads me to my first question. In your book, you say that even the leaders of the communist world, the nomenclatura, were very few of them, in fact, believers in communist dogma. How do we account for that?
Well, when the movement first got underway, that is, in the early years of the 20th century, to become a Bolshevik, a follower of Lenin, was a risk. There were no benefits to it. There was only a risk. You could be arrested, persecuted, you had to live abroad, penniless, and so on. After the Bolsheviks seized power, very quickly, they took over all the organized life in the country, including the economy, and joining the Bolshevik party was beneficial to you. It gave you security, it gave you all kinds of benefits which others did not enjoy. So you had a massive influx of opportunists. And Stalin, in fact, promoted this when he took power in the later 20s, because he didn't want ideologists or ideologues. He wanted people who looked out for their interests. He could then buy them. So you had really, the nomenclatura was really a group of people who were looking out for their own interests and didn't care at all about the ideology.
But the superstition, I guess we call it that, prevailed, that these were the true apostles of the movement. That's correct, isn't it?
Well, they had to pretend. I mean, they spoke that language. When you read the minutes of the Politburo, many of them are now available, the leaders of that movement talked the way they preached abroad in ideological terms. But did they believe it? I quote here Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita. Yeah. He said he had always difficulty understanding what communism was, so he asked Papa. And Papa said, well, son, I'm really not very clear myself what communism is. And here is a man who was telling the whole world that it will turn communist in the coming decades.
Well, that notwithstanding, a deviation, dogmatical deviation, was a cause for ejection, but was that purely opportunistic?
Well, no, there had to be kind of group loyalty. So, for example, you had to profess certain things. They didn't care whether you believed them or not. You just had to profess them. And I remember standing once in line in the Lenin Library. There were young people preparing for exams, and they were asking each other questions and repeating these formulas, which were totally meaningless. They meant nothing to them, but just had to say them in the way they were dished out to them. And Now, there are certain things you couldn't do. If you were a churchgoer, you might get into trouble. But otherwise, all you had to do is just mouth the line and obey, and everything was okay.
In your book, you you have a small section on the radical French thinkers of the early 19th century, and then you talk about the impact on the budding idea of common property of Darwin. Can you tell us what that nexus was?
Well, it is not that Darwin had a direct influence on the notion of abolishing private property, but Darwin injected into sociology a kind of dynamism, the notion that things develop in a certain way and go through stages. Because you had sort of evolutionary sociology. Now that permitted Marx to say that originally mankind knew nothing about private property. Private property came in gradually as a result of class differentiation, and ultimately will disappear. That is the contribution of Darwin, and an involuntary contribution. He didn't mean to make it, but that's how they used Darwin.
But the doctrine of the necessity of this evolutionary change was in fact a contribution of Marx and Engels, is it not?
Yes. Well, they thought they demonstrated why capitalism had to collapse within their contradictions, and why socialism had to triumph.
Well, did the Fabians think it had to collapse, or just was their position simply that the clear preferences for it would assert themselves to civilized discriminations?
Fabians thought probably, I think, that socialism was inevitable, but it had to come gradually, not by violence, not by revolution, but by just gradual transformation of capitalism into socialism.
Well, but was it predictable under Fabian, in Fabian thought?
Predictable.
Was it necessary?
Yeah, I think it was.
A necessary consequence?
Yeah, it was a necessary consequence
so,
of, yes, because the public sphere was so much more efficient, and gradually everything was becoming more and more public and less private.
You touch on, but don't develop completely the odd appeal of communism to so many intellectuals. This is normally understood as simply being a union of an ideology and idealistic hunger. The notion that poverty would be abolished, and that the sharp edges of property would be assuaged, to appeal to a lot of people. But we reached a point, did we not, and here you do touch on this, that where the experience of communism in the flesh should have discouraged people, even as National Socialism in Germany, at a certain point, discouraged people who were originally attached to it. How do you account for the rather off-putting time it required so many people to have this perception?
Well, I think that many intellectuals who were sympathetic to socialism or to communism weren't really interested in the reality of it. It was the ideal that appealed to them. I was in France for a year on the Guggenheim Fellowship in 56, 57, where all these things were happening in Hungary. And it was shortly after Khrushchev's revelations about Stalin. And it was appalling. It had absolutely no effect on French intellectuals. I would give lectures to them, and I could sense the hostility. You're demolishing their dream, their fantasy. They were interested in the idea, not in the reality.
On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag had an enormous impact on the intellectuals, didn't they?
Yeah, but that was already much later. That was already in the 70s.
They were ready to grow up.
Yeah, I think that was 20 years later.
Some of them died of old age.
Yeah, well, I think Niels Bohr said that old ideas die when the people who hold them die. The 70s were different from the 50s.
Well, in terms of your experience in the academic world, what was the most effective way of handling people who were slow to acknowledge the scale of communist atrocities? You mentioned here that the Black Book on Communism guesses the victims at between 80 and 100 million, which is more than in both world wars.
So far more.
Now, those are appalling figures. You would think that the impact of them would have jarred almost anyone from a complacent attitude towards it. What was it, just invincible ignorance, as we Catholics say?
No, it wasn't ignorance. I mean, they could have learned. They didn't want to face the reality because they had this fantasy, this dream, that communism is feasible, that communism, of course, is good. And if it isn't working out, or hasn't worked out, is because, one, it has been tried in the wrong country, in a rather backward country like Russia or China, and two, because of the unalterable so-called hostility of the West, which made it very difficult for them to put their ideas into practice. And you asked me how I coped with this. I always compared it to a situation in which, if I found myself, say, in the 14th century, and I was an outstanding scientist, I knew the Earth was round, but everybody around believed the Earth is flat. I said, well, just wait, you'll find out, it is round. And I very rarely engaged in polemics because it just seemed to me futile. The evidence was there, and it'll catch up with you. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and I think a lot of people did change their mind. But very few people admitted it, that they had been wrong. They just simply accepted this fact and went on with their business.
But it was polite in those circumstances not to point to a fellow traveling past, right? Just
on their part, you mean?
Yeah, well, and on your part as someone who spoke with them.
You know, billions of dollars were spent on study of the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc through the various institutes, universities, and so on. They all proved to be wrong. I mean, there was an absolute consensus, virtually uniform consensus. I can think in this country only of two people who didn't share it, there's Bob Conquest and myself, that the Soviet Union is stable and the Soviet Union is popular. When you said, no, it's not stable and it's not popular, you were considered to be an eccentric. Now, they proved to be wrong. You would have expected that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, they would have sat down and, like scholars and scientists, and analyzed the reasons for being wrong. Where did we go wrong? So we don't make this mistake again. But they haven't done that. I have not seen any sort of postmortems of Sovietology.
Now, how do you account for that? Just pride?
Well, yeah, people don't want to admit.
They don't want to admit that they were wrong, and nobody is so impolite as to insist that they account for their having.
Well, that's yeah. They have to admit they were wrong, but also have to analyze why they were wrong, and they continue to be wrong for the same reason, which is, for example, they don't allow for morality in politics. They don't allow for cultural differences. All these things that made them misconceive the Soviet bloc are still playing a part today in the analysis of foreign civilizations.
And there's no obvious reprisal there. Is it if it's the economist who predicts something that doesn't happen and do so exuberantly, you can stop patronizing him or patronizing a broker who makes bad predictions. But you can't stop patronizing the CIA, which predicted that the Soviet Union's economy was going on at a huge speed, right?
Yeah. No, nothing has happened to them. They have not analyzed themselves, and they have not been punished, and that is simply reality.
Well, why isn't this an enticing academic project, which would involve going to individual survivors and say, I mean, Max Lerner wrote an autobiography in which he mentioned why he thought that the purge trials hadn't happened. So at least he accosted the problem. But that isn't general, is it?
No, you're right. I mean, I myself am not interested in doing that because I'm much more interested in finding out what's true rather than what was false. I mean, yes, you could do that and point out A was wrong, B was wrong, C was wrong for such and such reasons, but so what in the end?
Why shouldn't you be interested in what made people be wrong?
Because life is short, and I want to find out what the truth is.
I think you're going to live forever. Well, you mentioned in your book, apropos adjustments to reality, that when the Soviet Union was liberated from itself, they couldn't quite catch on to the natural way of doing things. They were so accustomed to taking directions.
Yeah.
And then what they did, you remind us, is simply take what advantage they could of existing situations, take over factories and everything else.
Yes. First of all, the nomenclatura, the ruling class, threw itself on the state possessions and appropriated them. And I talked to one of the leaders of the post-Soviet Russian state, who was in fact in power at the time. I said, why did you let them do that? I mean, they stole national property. Oh, he said, it should be obvious. He said, because we want to prevent a counter-revolution. We bought them off. We simply bought them off by throwing away all the state property, so they lost power, but they acquired wealth, and they gave us no trouble. As for the average citizen, well, one of the legacies of communism is that ordinary citizens have lost work ethic and have lost a sense of honesty, because the only way you could survive under the Soviet system was to steal. And I quote here a Soviet proverb: if you don't steal from the government, you steal from your own family. So everybody was accustomed to stealing. If you didn't steal, your family would starve. And that is now carried into the post-Soviet era.
You're mentioning stealing. Reminds me that we met a few years ago on my program when you were talking about your book on property. And here, of course, you touch on property frequently. Is it becoming increasingly palpable that a respect for property is a necessary bulwark of respect for freedom?
In very small elite circles, yes. My book, by the way, was translated into Russian and is circulating. And I get from time to time books from Russia where people make this point. The vast majority of people don't understand it. They don't understand the connection between the protection and safeguarding of property and freedom and law and so on. They don't understand it. To them, property is still a form of exploitation. They haven't gotten out of their Soviet mode of thinking. For the majority. It's just a very thin layer of intelligentsia that has.
You're talking about in Russia or in general?
In Russia. No, in Eastern Europe it's not so, because there are old traditions of private property. But the point I made in my book was that private property in the means of production came to Russia very late. Then until the end of the 18th century, all the land, which was the principal form of wealth in Russia, productive wealth, belonged to the state. And only Catherine the Great in 1785 transferred property of land to the nobles. That's the beginning of landed property. And even today it meets tremendous resistance. The other day Putin signed a bill allowing the privatization of land, with the exception of agricultural land, which means that basically only 3%, I read today in the paper, only 3% of Russian land can be privatized. They have tremendous aversion to all of that. It has deep roots in Russian culture. And that's not the case in Poland or Hungary.
You spoke a moment ago about how the work ethic more or less disappeared in Soviet Russia. A sense, however, of the importance of property seems to me to be intuitive. Is it not? That is, people who own whatever feel that the ownership of it ought not to be challenged.
Yes. Well, acquisitiveness, I believe, is universal among animals and human beings. Acquisitiveness, getting things. But the point in property is to respect the property of others, and that's to be taught. And our culture has developed. We will realize that we cannot encroach on the property of our neighbors because they will encroach on ours. But they don't have this sense at all. They grab what they can, and the notion somehow that in order to be able to hold on to this, they have to respect the property of their neighbors has not developed yet. That will take time.
But why isn't it a normal syllogistic habit to acknowledge that if I'm acquisitive and I want to own this, it means that you don't own it, right?
That's right.
And the fact that you do not own it generates a corresponding belief, does it not, in your property over there?
Well,
or is it your point that it does not?
No, logically it does, psychologically not. Not necessarily, in other words. It might, but it has to be taught. I mean, children. In my book on property, it's called Property and Freedom, I cite studies done of little children, toddlers. They are extremely acquisitive. First words they learn is mine. And they grab things. But they're not so careful about the property of others. And they're very gladly appropriated. They have to be taught by the parents or by the teachers. They must respect the property of others. But you have a society such as Russia, where nobody taught anybody to respect any properties, including state properties, and therefore it's a free-for-all.
Your mention of that point and of agriculture a moment ago leads me to ask you this about the Chilean experience with which you deal. In my own experience, I hear or see most often cited as an aborted venture into communism of a kind that is pays attention to democratic safeguards. The experience in Chile in 1970, I think it was. Now, you analyze what happened there and the impact of industrialization on a country in which property consisted of owning land, right? Tell us what it was that happened, and to what extent is it correct to say that a democratic socialist evolution was interrupted by the 73 coup?
Yeah. Well, I would object to the word coup. I don't think he really had a coup. What happened was that there were elections.
What do they call it when you shoot the president?
Well, no, the president. Well, let me get to it. The elections in Chile resulted in a standoff. That is, Allende got just a sliver more of a vote than his two other contenders, and the thing was thrown in the Chamber of Deputies, which was dominated to a large extent by Christian Democrats. They made a pact with Allende that they would give him the authority, the power, but he had to subscribe to a certain charter of what he will obey constitutional rights, property rights, and so on and so forth. And on that basis, he assumed power. He then very quickly began to violate these rights. Not that he himself was such a fanatical communist, but the people behind him were. And they were admirers of Castro and so on, which he was too. And this went on for a couple of years.
He hung a picture of Castro in his office.
I beg your pardon?
He hung a picture of Castro in his office. Yeah, he was an admirer.
But he was not, Castro too, I don't think was originally a fanatical communist, but became one. In any event, this went on, and there was growing disenchantment, and because they could not entirely abolish freedom of the press, and the government controlled the radio, but the press was free, there was a great deal of ferment in the country. And eventually, and I give you the dates, the Chamber of Deputies voted that with a rather large majority, that Allende had violated the compact, which he had signed. And because we have no procedures for impeachment in the Chilean constitution, they asked Pinochet to remove him from power, which is what he did. Allende resisted and then committed suicide. But this was not a coup. This was legitimate removal from office at the request not only of the Chamber of Deputies, but of the Constitutional Court. This is not generally known, I realize. I didn't know it myself. I learned it only when I was writing this book.
Well, the evolution of what once was simply a democratic socialist movement became despotic. And you point to the fact that in order to continue to bribe the people whose support he solicited, he diminished the value of the peso to where it was inflating at the rate of 300% per year, and it was the truckers who were the catalysts in that.
Right.
But still, one hears it said again and again and again. At least I hear it said again and again that we stepped in and aborted a democratic socialist movement. That's an indefensible compression, isn't it? Well,
there was an item to this effect in the New York Times a couple of months ago. I sat down and wrote a letter to the New York Times explaining what the facts are. They never published it, because this is just an axiom among liberal intellectuals in this country.
A little louder, please.
Yes. Maybe I'll hold it here. Okay.
You were saying you were... Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
No? I should have it.
Well,
okay.
This is probably a good moment then to move, as we do by tradition at the end of the half hour, to questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Are the Russian
Oh, yeah, hang on 1 second. We'll give you a mic here, then we can hear without any problem.
To speak up, and you don't have to. The father of Russian communism, Marxism, Plekhanov, did not, of course, go along with the revolution because it was inconsistent with the Marxist ideology, and he opted to end his days in the West. And even though, that is, the Leninism proved itself to be a fiasco, however, socialism in its symbiotic form with capitalism, symbiotic with capitalism, isn't that also a socialist challenge to the United States, particularly as the United States has been moving for the last 20 years towards greater, laissez-faire capitalism?
You mean the welfare state?
Yeah, the welfare state. And as you see the elections in Berlin or in Italy, the former communists have joined and to some extent been very successful in joining social democracy.
Well, there are two separate aspects here. Capitalism had adopted elements from socialism, but not the fundamental element, which is the abolition of private property. And which is, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels said, if you want to, in one sentence, say what is the essence of communism, is the abolition of private property. And all our Western states accept and protect private property. So yes, we have taken a few steps in the direction, but basically capitalism is well and alive. That is for this. As for the communists, well, they've just won elections in Poland. But these are no longer communists. They're ex-communists. They don't propound a communist program. They propound a social democratic program. We had at Harvard 3 or 4 years ago Zyuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party. We had him at lunch and began to pepper him with questions. Mr. Zyuganov, do you believe in private property? He says, yes, of course. Do you believe in democratic elections? Yes, of course, certainly. And we went on like this. Well, in what sense are you a communist? You're not a communist. You're a social democrat, perhaps at best. So what you have in Eastern Europe, and the reason why the communists are doing well, or ex-communists are doing well, is that under the communist regime, they were the only one who get political experience. I mean, in order to get political experience, you had to join the Communist Party. So you had, in the process of abolishing the communist system, you had a lot of intellectuals playing a major part. I mean, Lech Walesa, who was an electrician, could play a major role in bringing down communism in Poland, but he couldn't run Poland because he had no experience. He was an electrician. So you now have ex-communists coming back into power, but no longer as communists, but as ex-communists, propounding essentially social democracy. And I find this acceptable. I mean, Kwaśniewski, the president of Poland, is an ex-communist. He doesn't advance any communist slogans anymore at all.
But is there any sense in which people who do this can be held to be security risks, i.e., have they, by their past experience, shown that they were really indifferent to the respect for human freedom, or is it like your academic colleagues, we have to simply forget about their past?
Well, there were all kinds of communists. There were communists who really were simply administrators, managers, who joined the party because it was a way to a career. And there were people who really used the power which they had to torment people and so on. The latter have on the whole retired from politics because they're very unpopular. But the former group, I don't see anything wrong with them entering politics.
Next question. Yes, sir. It's over there. I don't think that mic is magnifying the sound very much.
Well, we'll see in a minute. I have a friend who...
hear.
Do you hear me?
Sort of.
Is it working? Okay. I have a friend who told me he was born in the Soviet Union and he grew up there. And he said all his years in the Soviet Union, he never once met a communist. He said the first time he met a communist was when he went to graduate school at Berkeley. And there he met a lot of communists. And I asked him, why you of all people should be able to explain, in view of your history and your background, that the system doesn't work. And his answer was he didn't even try because he thought these people were just out in outer space somewhere. He didn't think there was any point in talking to them. But my question really is, what is the appeal of communism to people who are of reasonably rational mind and people who really feel they want to advance the human agenda, they want to see progress, but communism is something that it seems to me the most basic and simple understanding of human beings would indicate that it won't work, and I don't understand this appeal. Why besides that, it deprives people of some of the most fundamental rights that we just take for granted in the Western world. And so perhaps you could address that.
You're quite right. I am no person to explain it because I never understood it. I never shared these views. But there are people who cling to this belief because it seemed to them to be noble, to improve humanity, to open perspectives before humanity, which capitalism does not. They see all the worst things in capitalism and only the good things in communism. And if communism hasn't worked out yet, they will say, it's because it hasn't been tried properly, or because Russia was not the country in which it should have tried it. If it were in the West, it would have succeeded much better, and so on and so forth. But, you cannot argue with people who hold these beliefs.
Of course you can argue with them.
Well, I find it extremely frustrating. If you find today, in Pakistan, I read some statistics, something like 40% of the population believes that it is Jews that carried out the attack on the World Trade Center. Well, what can you do? Are you going to sit down and argue with them? The majority of Pakistanis believe the Jews did it. So you confront this.
70% of Americans don't think that Kennedy was assassinated by just Oswald, right?
Yeah. So you really, I've learned. Life, as I repeat, is short, and there are a lot of things to learn. And you can deal so much with errors. You can try to explain them, but if people persist, you say, "Well, very good. Persist in your errors, and I'll go on to do other things."
Yes, sir.
In the light of the current situation in the world and our problems of the moment, I find it fascinating that many of the former communist parties still take a almost visceral, reactive, anti-American stand. You see that with the Italian Communist Party. Could you discuss that? How this really communist fealty to this idea has become such a kind of anti-Americanism? I
try to explain it, but take the Italians. I'm very fond of Italians. I think they're wonderful people. They're not fanatics. And I lived under Mussolini for 7 months during the war. And there was an opera buffa. It wasn't really serious. People talk totalitarian regime. Well, I wonder, there's apparently 30% of Italians support the attack on the World Trade Center. But I recently had dinner with an Italian scholar. He says, we discussed this, and he said, these people are orphans of communism. They're people who saw their life beliefs being taken away. Why? Because America demolished communism. And they hate America for that, because it destroyed their dreams. I can't explain it in any other way. I don't have any direct experience with it. I didn't question these people, but it does make sense to me. Roughly, the Communist Party would have been roughly 1/3 of the Italian electorate, wouldn't it? So that's roughly it. And in Russia, yes, I was in Russia last month, and I was told that 30% of Russians approve of the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings. And again, that corresponds to the number of communists in the country. The communist vote was about 30%. So I think the ex-communists feel their lives have been shattered, their dreams have been shattered, and America is to blame, and capitalism is to blame. So that kind of visceral reaction.
I think there's also a tendency to be against the big guys, the superpower.
England was that object of hatred in the 19th century.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There was a question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. It has long seemed to me that communism is really Christianity without Christ, without the spiritual matrix. The first thing they did, one of the very first things, was to eliminate believers. And went on an extremely brutal regime, starting with Lenin. And when I was in Russia, I'm a Slavicist, and when I was in Russia in the 60s, all over the buildings, big signs, "Если враг не сдается, уничтожить его." If your enemy doesn't succumb, eliminate him, exterminate
That's
him.
not
Very, very brutal.
is it?
Pardon?
That's not Christianity.
I'm saying without the Christ. There's without the spiritual matrix, you get a brutal, destructive regime. Now, I worked also for Diana Trilling for 3 years when she was writing her memoir about the early 30s in this country. And she said McCarthy was right. There was a communist under every bed. And it just, the failure, the failure of the moral compass of the intellectuals in this country and around the world just absolutely astonishes me.
No, you're right. Intellectuals in general want to be scientists because science has the great prestige. So historians, literary critics, anthropologists, they want to be scientists. Now, of course, one of the distinguishing characteristics of science is that it's morally neutral. And what has happened to history, what has happened to political science, is they don't want to pass judgment, moral judgment. And I used to argue with them. You cannot eliminate moral judgments from politics. They're colorblind. You don't understand what moves people and what annoys them, what irritates them, and what inspires them. But there's a battle you cannot win, because people who say, for example, my history of the Russian Revolution, it's written as an angry book. Yes, it is an angry book. I'm angry at people who fooled millions of their fellow citizens and told them they're going to have perfect freedom and everything else and enslaved them. I'm angry about that, as I was angry about the Nazis. I find nothing incompatible with scholarship in that. That is to say, I present my evidence in a perfectly honest way, and then I pass judgment on it. I don't tamper with the evidence to suit my moral predilections. But that is very much a minority view in today's scholarship, which is supposed to be colorblind morally.
Well, the horrific thing to me is that it quickly moves from neutrality into no-fault amorality.
Well, and
as Diana pointed out, the most fervent communists she knew all had in mind to become the commissars.
Yeah.
So there we go, self-interest.
Well, the business of having things in common, causing them to be in some sense similar or related is a bad logical temptation. I remember a while making that point once in some public exchange, and I said, look, the man who pushes an old lady out of the way of an oncoming bus is not comfortably to be compared to the man who pushes a lady into the way of an oncoming bus, though they both can be said to be pushing people around. Now that I think is a temptation of people who say, well, Christianity without Christ is communism. If you say, well, Christianity enjoins a love for one's neighbor, including a responsibility to try to help that a neighbor, is really not to be compared with a system that says you don't have a property; it belongs. It's a collectivity. So that what they then have in common in a more sophisticated analysis, in my stresses their dissimilarity, i.e., what you're not prepared to do. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I quote in my book Vladimir Solovyov, the Russian philosopher of the late 19th century, who objected to any comparisons between socialism and Christianity on the grounds that Christianity tells you to give away your own property, and socialism tells you to take away the property of others. Big difference. I don't buy these comparisons between. There were many.
Did you have your hand up? Sorry. Did you have your hand up?
There were religious elements in socialism and communism, but the passion.
I meant that as sort of like a little parable, but also the it really, I think we talk a lot now about fundamentalist religions and their danger. This is fundamentalist secularism, fundamentalist materialism, and it's still being spread around the world. That's the sad thing.
Well, let's go to this lady first because she hasn't asked. Then we'll go back to you.
I would like to ask you if you could comment something about Trotsky and the Spartakists with.
Could you speak a little louder?
If you could comment on Trotsky and the Spartakist movement.
And his what?
The Spartakist movement.
The Spartakist movement. Well,
yes.
He was not practically involved. No, the Spartakist movement was a German yes, communist movement of the 1919.
Yes.
Well, I have a very low opinion of Trotsky. I mean, I don't think he was that much better than he was more cultivated. He wrote better. He spoke better than the others. But morally speaking, he was not a great deal better than Lenin, and only a trifle better than Stalin, I think. He's the one who introduced concentration camps into Russia in 1918. He is the one who introduced the principle that the party is always right, which ultimately destroyed him, because he couldn't fight, even when they accused him of crimes he hadn't committed, and so on. So he's liked by many intellectuals because he was more literate than the others. And a very good writer and a very good, superb speaker. It's said that Hitler studied his speeches to learn how to address mobs. But as far as his own moral predilections are concerned, I don't think he was really much better. The Spartacus movement was a movement in Germany at the end of the war, a communist movement which tried to take power and was defeated.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then you.
Yeah. Both of you gentlemen stated that capitalism, respects private property. If that is true, shouldn't you qualify it that capitalism is very selective in respecting private property? And I'd like to make 2 points. One is, if the capitalists were respecting private property, why would they go to wars with each other in quest of conquering each other's property? Secondly, that is, capitalism very often consigns certain people as property. For example, African Americans, let's say Locke consigned Africans as property, or I.G. Farben consigned Jews as property. It's only a question of being able to do it, let's say, through legally, but there's no genuine respect for property as such.
No, I beg to differ with you. I mean, the fact that capitalist countries go to war with each other does not mean they do not respect their own property. In case of Germany, which was only doubtfully a capitalist country, they tried to seize the property of others. I mean, the Holocaust was in many ways a way of stealing property, Jewish property. They began with stealing property, ended with stealing property. But when the Germans expanded all over Europe, they acquired a tremendous amount of wealth that way. Now, slavery is a special problem. It's universal. It existed all over the world. We weren't the only ones to have slaves. It exists and exists to this day in many parts of the world, in Sudan and elsewhere. It's very difficult to justify it morally. But strictly speaking, if you look at it strictly from the legal point of view, you can say, yes, the slave is my property, I bought him, or I saved his life rather than kill him, which was how slavery began in something like the Roman Empire. So the existence of slavery, while it's morally very dubious, does not vitiate the principle of property.
Plus also, I think to believe in something doesn't guarantee that you won't abuse it.
Yeah.
The predator exists collectively and individually, but that doesn't invalidate the philosophical appeal of his commitment to property.
I would expect you to say something else, and I raised that issue in my Property and Freedom in the last chapter, namely that through taxation, through various acts of legislation, the capitalist government, in fact, is encroaching on property in a very dangerous way. For example, it interferes with our rights to rent to whomever we choose. It puts wetlands under protection, which doesn't allow us to exploit these wetlands. It establishes minimum wages, which violates the freedom of contract, and so on and so forth. That is happening, indeed. And I wrote this in my book, and I aroused a storm of outrage.
And we had a question. You're next, and you're next, and then one more, and we'll have to. So we have 3 questions coming up. 1, 2, and the third person, whoever volunteers. Yes, ma'am.
It seems that the power of Marxism has been as the intellectual equipment of the liberal agenda, of those who counter capitalism. I mean, Marxism provides a historical, social, unifying theory for intellectuals to counter capitalism, to counter the abuses of capitalism especially. And Marxism in many ways has been co-opted as the language of the oppressed, the language of the inner city, fight the power. So if you, I mean, in your book you invalidate Marxism and communism, its natural outgrowth, as a theory. So I'd like to hear your opinion on what you think the next intellectual liberal theory is. What is the answer to capitalism, the counter to capitalism?
Well, this anti-globalism now is one manifestation of it. It's a powerful movement, emotionally very powerful. It has no theoretical underpinnings. I was in London last May 1st, and they expected major riots. And there were 5,000 policemen and 2,000 rioters in Oxford Circus. And the slogans advanced were absurd. One major group there was a group of bicyclists who wanted more bicycle paths in London. But it's a movement full of pathos, full of anger against capitalism and globalization, without any theory. But you wait, somebody will come around and give them a theory. But I think anti-globalization is now the way. They've abandoned Marxism. They no longer believe in the inevitability of revolution and all of that. But they appeal to many of the same people, including anarchists. So that is, I think, is taking shape right before our very eyes.
And over here, yes, sir.
My perception of communism championing liberation movements throughout the world and capitalism supporting fascist and racist regimes throughout the world, I gather you would disagree with that.
Yes, I would.
Okay, I support, in other words, I celebrated Fidel Castro and the Cubans and the work that they did in Africa. Why would you disagree with their presence in Africa? I presuppose you would disagree.
Well, I mean, when you say that capitalist countries supported fascism, and I presume you mean Nazism too. Capitalist countries supported every regime that brought them money. They supported the communists. The Soviet 5-year plans were built with Western capital and Western machinery.
And we supported communism against Hitler.
Yeah. Hitler, the myth that Hitler was supported by the German capitalists has been blown to pieces. The German capitalists fell into line once he acquired power and collaborated with him, but were not particularly happy about him. Soviet Union supported Hitler. The Soviet Union forbade in the critical election of 1932 the communists to support the Social Democrats. If you look at the statistics, I cite them in this book, the statistics of the critical election that brought Hitler to power. The Social Democrats and the communists had enough vote to defeat the Nazis, but Stalin gave strict orders to the communists not to collaborate because he considered the Social Democrats to be a greater enemy of Soviet Union and communism than Hitler. This is very convenient. It's capitalist supported fascism. Capitalist supported communism. Communist supported fascism.
You avoided the racial.
And what is the racial argument?
For example, the United States support of South Africa and Rhodesia, and subsidizing anti-government forces in Angola, backing up people like who's continued this feudal war in Angola. His name escapes me.
Well, I can say that I'm terribly well versed on what happened in Angola, but I think I can say with some confidence that it's ultimately our pressure that brought down the apartheid regime in South Africa. Okay? We did it, not the Soviet Union. We took a moral stand on this. So we have sins on our conscience, but we have a lot of virtues.
We recognize de jure government. That's been the rule for centuries. Right. And we recognized Rhodesia until it had this final split with Great Britain. Yeah. And then we eventually boycotted it. And we recognized the government of South Africa because it was the government of South Africa. To suggest that we did is a vote of sympathy for apartheid is simply, I think, intellectually incorrect.
Just as we recognize Stalin in 1933, and that was not a vote of confidence in Stalin's methods. Yeah. It was just he was in power, and there was a state-to-state relationship.
And we ended up recognizing Mao's China.
Mao's China, yeah.
We have the third question, the last question coming up. Yes, sir.
Now that communism is gone, is the real problem we're going to have, Mr. Pepys, the Muslim world?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Will the Muslim challenge be the great challenge now that communism is gone?
Well, it looks like it. It's a very powerful challenge because you have here 1 billion people professing a faith that, not in its original theory, but how it was worked out, is very intolerant and very aggressive, very expansionist. religion that once was extremely powerful. I mean, if you go back to the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, the Muslims, particularly the Arabs, were way ahead of us in terms of civilization. And then they collapsed sometime in the late Middle Ages, were defeated, were humbled. And there's a tremendous desire now to avenge this and to be once again the superpower in the world. It's a very, very genuine problem, and I don't think that our authorities quite understand it. They talk about building up a coalition, a Muslim coalition, and so on. That is very naive. It's just simply this. You don't have to be an expert on this subject to realize that bin Laden has overwhelming support in the streets of Muslim countries, from one end of the Muslim world to the other. So yes, I'm afraid we're going to be facing a terrible challenge.
Well, I'll take advantage of the leverage I have here to make the final comment, which is that I'm 75 years old, and this is the first time I've ever attended a bookstore event where I wasn't promoting my own book. So I take advantage of the fact that I'm not promoting my own book to say, you came here, you listened to him, he was very good to you, you know how bright his book is, you really ought to buy it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Authors Ronald and Susan Shapiro